Adam B. Seligman is professor of religion at Boston University and research associate at the Institute of Culture, Religion, and World Affairs there. He has lived and taught at universities in this country, in Israel and Hungary, where he was Fulbright Fellow. He did his doctorate in Hebrew University and has lived for 20 years in Israel and was a member of Kibbutz Kerem Shalom for many of those years. He has published many books, some of which are the standard reference on the subject. His book on the idea of civil society, his book on the problem of trust, have been cited thousands of times, and he has an international reputation on these topics. He's written many other books. I was just, especially a book which I think is very important for this. All these books are important for this forum, but I'll mention one more, the book on ritual and its consequences. But aside from his academic interests, he has very important civil society interests. He's founding director of an organization, to my mind, very interesting and important organization called CEDAR, Communities Engaging with Difference and Religion. This had an initial incarnation as the International Summer School of Religion and Public Life, which runs programs that deal with difference today in Africa, in Uganda, and in Bulgaria, and possibly in other places. And I would just like to conclude on a personal note, and that is that I've been friends with Adam since 1986, when we both participated in Eisenstadt's seminar on the axial age and utopias. And his voice, to my mind, has been missing from the Israeli conversation. And I think this is a voice which is informed by the finest scholarship and intense personal commitment. So, with deep personal pleasure, I'd like to invite Professor Adam Seligman to speak.
Thank you, Shlomo. Thank you very much. So, we told a number of stories this morning, and I'll begin with a story. A story that I hope will illustrate the problem that I wish to outline here. The problem is the problem of boundaries. Boundaries were mentioned this morning. And how rights, human rights, and a discourse of rights... Lo shomim? Sorry. Okay. I guess I'll have to use the microphone after all. So I want to tell a story that highlights the problem of boundaries and how a discussion of rights and a discourse of rights does not so much alleviate the discomfort and unease we feel when our boundaries are broached, but rather exacerbates the problem itself. The story that I want to tell is as follows. For a number of years, as Shlomo mentioned, I have been running a summer program on how to live with difference. In 2011, we ran the program in Plovdiv, Bulgaria, and at one of the sessions, the anthropologist from Macedonia, Elizabeta Koneska, showed her documentary movie called Shared Shrines. The movie, not surprisingly, is on a shared shrine in Macedonia, used by different Muslim sects, Sunni, Shia, Bektashi, Alevi, as well as by Orthodox Christians, and also actually non-Orthodox Christians. The response of our participants was fascinating. Among many of the Russian Orthodox participants of the program, there was outrage, absolute outrage, at such a violation of boundaries, different people using the same shrine, which they saw as sacrilege. A similar reaction was expressed by religiously obligated Sunni Muslims from Kosovo and Bosnia, who saw this as shirk. On the other hand, a number of secular participants, foremost of which was a secular Israeli woman, who applauded the movie and saw it as the correct and necessary overcoming of all particularities, of all boundaries, in some new universalism. From my perspective as organizer, I should add, what was so interesting was how people reacted to this documentary film, not as providing new information on lived religion in the Balkans, but as evincing some moral agenda towards which they had to take a stance, either for it or against it. What everyone was struggling with, however, was clearly the issue of boundaries. Boundaries are by their nature ambiguous. This is because they are both defined by the center of meaning and order which they circumscribe, but are also perennially open to what is beyond the order-giving power of the center, right? So a boundary, here is the center, this is the boundary, circumscribed by the center, but it's also open to the forces outside the center. Ambiguous, they are dangerous as well. A truth we know from generations of anthropologists working in the traditions of Mary Douglas and others. A truth we also know from the treatment of marginal groups whose marginality is defined precisely vis-à-vis the margin or boundary of the dominant group, whoever this may be. We know this as well from the bloody wars of many centuries, if not millennia, fought so often over a violation of boundaries. Herodotus, of course, begins his very histories with such a violation in the form of the kidnapped Vio. And the connection of women in boundaries is a whole other topic worthy of our study, perhaps another time. The above story illustrates the discomfort that we feel upon approaching our boundaries as well as the boundaries of others. It illustrates as well what I want to claim are the two quintessential modern solutions to boundaries. The first is to erase all boundaries, and this is represented by those secular folk who applauded the movie as the panacea to all of the world's problems. Simply deny all particularity, which means, of course, denying all difference. All religions are the same. By implication, all the people are the same. No point to dwell on differences, but celebrate the oneness. I think the Beatles wrote a song about this, or John Lennon did, right? Yes, thank you. The second response was the response of our young Orthodox and Muslim members, reifying the differences and boundaries between themselves and others into untranslatable essences. Both are modernist responses, in that both absolutize boundaries, either by totally doing away with them or by conceptualizing them as unbridgeable walls, rather closer to a brick wall than maybe to an amoeba's wall, right? Which we recall an amoeba has a boundary, but also a very permeable one. These responses are modernist in that they follow the very modern orientation towards boundaries, which sees them as razor-thin entities, reducible to individual units and markedly devoid of constitutive collective characteristics. This is what was talked about a lot this morning under the rubric of liberalism, right? In fact, I would say that the founding legal codes of modern society, defined, let us say, by the Déclaration des droits de l'homme et citoyen and the American Constitution, or for that matter, by Article 9 of the European Convention on Human Rights, or Article 10 of the Charter of Nice, quite simply do away with collective boundaries. I think this was best summed up by Count Stanislav de Clermont-Tonnerre in his 1789 speech to the National Assembly, where he said, "We must refuse everything to the Jews as a nation and accord everything to Jews as individuals." In a sense, this has been the project of all modern states, in the liberal form even more than in other more romantic national forms. It refers not simply to Jews, but to every corporate group, and certainly to those who consider themselves to be truth communities. Within the public sphere, boundaries are parsed into razor-thin edges, and individuals interact not as members of groups, but as bearers of rights, citizen rights, social rights, human rights, and so on. Group identities have been in the public sphere replaced by individual identities, and the challenge of living with and accommodating difference has been replaced by the legal recognition and entitlement of rights. To get a handle on this process, let us return for a moment to Clermont-Tonnerre's statement. I'll recall more than that one famous sentence. Let me read a slightly longer quote. "The Jew must be denied everything as a nation, but granted everything as individuals. They must disown their judges. They must have only ours. They must be refused legal protection for the maintenance of their supposed laws of the Jewish corporation. They must constitute neither a state nor a political corps, nor an order. They must individually become citizens. If they do not want this, they must inform us, and then we shall be compelled to expel them. The existence of a nation within a nation is unacceptable to our country." Today, of course, there are, or perceived to be, nations within nations everywhere, from Canada to Coventry, from Bulgaria to Birmingham, from Malaysia to Montgomery. This is the challenge that we are all facing, admittedly with very little success. An even cursory glance at the newspapers will make this point. Whether we look at the attitudes in Bulgaria towards Jehovah's Witnesses, in Malaysia towards Indians and Chinese, in Israel towards Palestinians, and Turks in Turkey towards Kurds and Alevis, in much of Western Europe towards Muslims, in Western Canada to First Nation tribes, the seeming impossibility of living with difference is continually at the forefront of a never-ending series of crises and confrontations. In Europe, the plight of Muslims is perhaps best known. In Denmark, for example, halal and kosher slaughter of animals has been prohibited because, in the words of the Minister of Agriculture and Food, quote, animal rights come before religion, end quote. At the same time, Muslims in major English cities are reporting that they stay more and more within their own familiar ethnic and religious neighborhoods and feel unsafe and threatened when they venture beyond these enclaves. The sentiment is not surprising, as anti-Islamic hate crimes have almost doubled in the years between 2011 and 2013, which is where I have data from. Nor, of course, is any of this new. Some 15 years ago in Lodi, Italy, pig urine was poured on a site designated for a mosque to prevent the mosque from being built. And of course, as we're talking now, ethnic Russians are engaged in a rapidly escalating series of conflict with ethnic Ukrainians in eastern Ukraine, while the 64 different ethnicities in South Sudan, including the Dinka, Moro, Bauri, Nuer, Lotoko, and Shilluk, are, we know, failing disastrously in their efforts to build the United States. In the post-contemporary World War II world, the solution proffered to these conflicts has more or less been along the lines laid down by an ideology of human rights, whose logic is, briefly, we are all human, we all have rights, and these rights trump other more particular concerns or obligations, and so must be respected above all else. When these rights come up against other ingrained communal dictates and traditions, such as infant circumcision, which we'll return to, a huge conflict of values ensues. As noted above, the extension of the notion of rights to all sentient beings, including animals, has resulted in similarly irreconcilable conflicts over different types of religious slaughter. Divergent views concerning the place of women and minors in different religious communities revolve around similar issues. In all cases, the core problem is that certain groups are less amenable than others to dissolving their sense of group belonging in favor of notions of universal humanity. The thrust of the modern world, first within the nation state over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries, and now on a global scale, is after all to transform all particular identities and loyalties, all religious communities, into a more overarching sense of identity and common values. Sadly, however, this orientation has often failed to provide people with a sense of belonging and a meaningful connection, and is at present being challenged both by religious, ethno-religious, and often just plain nationalist identities and commitments across Europe, Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and so on. In fact, I think we seem to have gone just about as far as we can go in the move to dissolve particular commitments and identities, to shorten the distance between self and other, or to render the gap meaningless in our new globalized consumer culture. A reaction is setting in, and neoliberal accolades to globalization are not going to reverse the trend, quite the opposite if the news this summer from Greece and Europe is any suggestion. I would like to suggest, however, that one way to expand our understanding of what is at stake may be through returning to some early anthropological work of Mary Douglas, which made famous the insights of the sociolinguist Basil Bernstein concerning two critical variables of culture, which I assume many people are familiar with, the notions of group and grid. Right? Group refers to the axis of group membership and belonging, right? And social controls may be tight and rigid, for instance, in a combat unit in the army, or relatively lax, a graduate cohort in a university humanities department, for instance, or of course anything in between, like an amateur sports team. As developed by Mary Douglas, the other axis of culture, grid, is that culture's classificatory system, the grid or matrix through which we make sense of the world. In Bernstein's original work, this grid was understood as being highly context-dependent as opposed to relatively abstract. I think if I draw a short diagram, I think it will make things clearer. Right, so in Bernstein's original work, you had a notion of an abstract system, right? And here, as opposed to it, you had dependent, right? This is positional, context dependent as opposed to abstract. What is the difference? We'll use an example. A context dependent grid would be the way a family firm, let's say, that's worked in the same building for 3 generations decides to whom to grant credit, right? Because they've been working in Bologna for 90 years, they've been in the same place, everybody knows the potential customers, at least the cousins of them, and on that basis they can decide who to grant credit to. A more abstract grid would be the one used, let's say, by a multinational corporation that would not know its customers, but would use an algorithm prepared by yet another multinational corporation in order to make decisions, right? So that would be abstract, and this would be conditional. Is it clear, the distinction? Yes? Okay, good. And then the other notion, as I said, so this would be grid. This is a classificatory system, and this would be group, and I'm sure this is not new to everybody, and to everybody in here, right? Here would be low, and here would be high, right? So a lot of social control in a military unit, a combat unit, low social control in a dance troupe, I don't know, amateur dance troupe, and this grid was famously used by Mary Douglas as an explanation of all cultural categories, which we're not going to go into. We can, in fact, see the general thrust of modernity, and this is the point I want to make, the general thrust of modernity as one that has eviscerated the axis of group membership and belonging as far as possible. That is, it has advanced an agenda of difference by simply denying group belonging, and thus making difference a purely individual attribute. So that essentially, to forget this for a moment, what modernity has done, it's moved us this way. It's moved us this way, right? It's eviscerated group belonging and moved more and more to understanding us simply as individual entities. However, our contemporary world is characterized by identity politics, a demand for recognition put forward by many groups, religious, ethnic, tribal, as well as those organized around sexual preference, the emergence of which has revealed the limits of this modern approach and the need, whether we like it or not, to accommodate group belonging and identity in the shared sphere of our public culture. What I'm suggesting here is that this new reality requires a dramatically different approach using the vertical axis of classification systems instead of the horizontal axis of group membership. We must henceforth produce our social classifications of the other within the crucible of a particular experience, right? Particular, and this is universal, abstract, right? In effect, we must return to a more particular, positional, and less abstract system of classificatory schema, and continually refer back to, as well as to judge, whatever to do, which is the basis of our schema. We must, for example, stress knowledge for, this is an important distinction I make here. I want to claim that as we approach the other, we should think in terms of knowledge for rather than knowledge of when engaging across boundaries. Doing so would, I believe, focus the mind on the concrete and particular experience rather than the abstract and the generalizable. Again, to produce it visually. What I'm saying is we have to move in this direction, which is totally counterintuitive, right? Because we produce our cultural grids and our normative grids, right, from Kant on the basis of the most universal, the most universally applicable. And I'm saying we have to move in another direction. In a sense, then, I'm arguing for the acceptance of a shared, even if dissimilar way of life, rather than common legal norms as the basis for a life with difference. This would be common legal norms. Interesting in this context to recall is that there was a translation of the Shulchan Aruch placed in every parliamentary court in France at the end of the Ancien Regime. A clear recognition that in pre-modern legal culture, different legal norms and desiderata were accepted. Not to mention the fact that Jews totally violated halachic strictures and made use of archayot shel goyim, but we know that doesn't interest us at the moment. But and I think that this argument of on the particular has certain resonances with ancient Confucian political thought, which makes its own distinctions between li, the power of ritual, and fa, the power of law. Fa, essentially words, legal norms, are of limited efficacy in establishing social harmony, because any word, any claim can be disputed. Words and all commands, all laws are words, immediately call forth their contraries. Any argument calls up the possibilities of a counter-argument, just as any command and any truth claim can invoke its counterfactual. For these reasons, the Confucians preferred li, that is ritual, as the basis of a shared life. Having no verbal or denotative dimension, ritual could not be argued, refuted, or opposed. Ritual is simply a set of acts. As acts, there are no contraries. This argument is surprisingly similar, again, to that made by the anthropologist Roy Rappaport on the critical role of ritual in establishing and maintaining social order, given the indeterminacy of language, even the downright propensity to lie that is inherent in our use of symbols. While I do not advocate shared rituals, indeed I'm skeptical of such a notion, as different communities have their own, I do strongly advocate shared experience. And this is where the notion of a shared, albeit dissimilar, set of needs, and this is where the notion of a shared life needs to be explicated and parsed. We recognize that experience may sometimes be uncomfortable. We may be the only observant Jews wearing a kippah, no less, in a sea of Irish faces at a Catholic wake. Or you may be the only Irish Catholic family attending a shiva. In both cases, you will probably be clueless as to the etiquette, but that is okay. An experience is being shared and a common habitus constructed, even as each group maintains its own loyalties and commitments and can participate only at the boundaries of the other's ritual world, and even as all feel somewhat uncomfortable in that interaction. Comfort is not the point. Sharing is the point. Boundaries, after all, are exciting places. They separate, but they also connect. Our property line, Frost was invoked this morning, our property line divides us from our neighbors, even as we can reach across it and share the time of day or a cup of tea. For centuries within the Ottoman Empire, Jews and Muslims in North Africa and the Arab lands shared sacred shrines, as did Christians and Muslims in countries such as Cyprus, Greece, Bulgaria, Macedonia, and the other Balkan lands. Only with the destruction of the empire and the emergence of ethnically and religious homogeneous, or claiming to be homogeneous nation-states, did this practice end, right? With different saints becoming firmly identified with one or another ethno-religious groups. We know the stories of Morocco, we know of Mimuna, we know of Jews offering the first bread to Muslims at the end at sunset in Ramadan. All these examples point to a shared life and a common culture built around very different ritual obligations, but nevertheless serving to bind communities together. A shared shrine is not a common religion, but one space shared and reserved for dissimilar practices is a strong marker of the ability to live in close proximity to the other in common, though again dissimilar culture. The reactions of many of our own school fellows to the documentary film that I mentioned shows how far we have come from that world, which has largely been replaced by the limiting conditions of law and the abstract notational systems separating individuals and groups into different places and separate spaces. Today, The most common arguments for how diverse peoples can share a world are predicated on human rights, that is, on law par excellence. Recent in origin, gaining traction only in the 1970s, the human rights argument has come to be seen by many as a panacea for almost all social ills, for the evils of social exclusion to different forms of prejudice, oppression, and the refusal to recognize or respect the other. In fact, according to Michael Ignatieff, human rights can even be seen in some contexts as a form of idolatry, putting human needs and aspirations on a pedestal that ultimately cannot be defended philosophically. Others see the whole discourse of human rights as rooted in a religious sensibility, shorn of any political context, indeed of any notion of human beings as existing within communities. The ideology of human rights is one of a universal individualism that at least one social thinker, Samuel Moyn, sees as a type of contemporary utopia. Significantly, human rights has never been tied to social rights or social democratic commitments, precisely the positive liberties or entitlements that humans can enjoy only within community. Hannah Arendt, of course, offered one of the most salient critiques of the idea of free-floating rights when she pointed out that rights, as understood in the 18th and 19th centuries, were all functions of men and women's positions within political communities. Divorced from these communities, rights simply made no sense. Where, she asked, would the right to have rights come from, if not from membership within a community, and all that that entailed? However we view the case, and whatever one's assessment, the fact remains that a rights discourse suffers from the weakness of other forms of fa, or legal notation. Their very articulation invites contraries. As soon as human rights are invoked, so are opposing demands for a discourse, let's say, of Asian values, or the idea of an Islamic Declaration of Human Rights, which was suggested in 1947, the UN Declaration. Indeed, squaring a global rights-based civilizational discourse with local cultural reasoning, whether predicated on Islamic Sharia or Halakha, is providing a formidable challenge to all those involved. As the former foreign minister of the Taliban in Afghanistan reportedly said, "We believe we are actually here to serve human rights, but there is a slight difference on the definition of these rights. We believe in rights according to Islam, and if anybody is trying to impose their definition of human rights on us, they will be sadly mistaken, because this world is not a world of one culture or one religion." While we may easily, and I think rightly, condemn the Taliban and detest their actions, it is more difficult to critique his point. A brief example will illustrate, and with this I'll probably end. In October 2013, the Council of Europe overwhelmingly passed a resolution condemning infant circumcision. That's Brit Milah for you guys here. Condemning infant circumcision as a violation of the physical integrity of children. And I quote, "The Pan-European Intergovernmental Organization called on member states to initiate public debate over the issue to protect the rights of children against human rights violations and adopt legal provisions to ensure certain practices will not be carried out before a child is old enough to be consulted." That's not 8 days, by the way, right? At the same time, in Sweden, the Ombudsman for Children also argued religious circumcision without the child's consent contravenes the basic rights of boys and it should be banned. This followed a series of rulings in German courts, first in Köln in 2012 in May, and then in Hamm on September 21st, 2013. The first ruled that circumcision caused grievous bodily harm and so was made an illegal act. The second demanded that circumcision be decided with the child and performed only with his consent. In December 2012, in response to widespread protest, Germany passed Law 1631D, declaring circumcision legal only when performed by a trained practitioner. The law, however, has done little to calm the waters and solve the irreconcilable conflict that is at the heart of this controversy. Because from the perspective of absolute individualism, ensconced in an ideology of abstract human right, it is in fact very difficult to defend cutting off a male infant's foreskin if there is no medical reason to do so. How then can we address this difference? How can we accommodate particular communities claiming adherence to the authority of a revealed and hence non-rational text and set of obligations that are outside the rational discourse of individualism and abstract rights? Indeed, if we recall the current attempts in Europe to ban kosher and halal slaughter on the basis of animal rights, we put this together with what I just told you about circumcision, we end up with a set of rules that, if fully implemented, would make it impossible for Jews or Muslims to live in Europe. They would not be able to eat, nor would they be able to induct their male children into their communities. under the rubric of a purely abstract and certainly reasonable set of strictures, we would end up effectively ridding Europe of communities that in some cases have lived there for millennia. A liberal rights-based approach would thus accomplish by law what Hitler failed to do by force. There must be some other way. This problem, in fact, takes us directly to what I think may be called communities of trust. That is, communities of mutuality, of belonging, as well as of shared obligation to very particular others, not to mention a sense of shared history, shared foods, jokes, commandments, that are in essence different. These communities of all that's shared, I want to claim it different from what I would call communities of confidence. That is, communities made up of generalized others, understanding the relations between them only in terms of justice. I would say in communities of belonging, we understand relations between us in terms of mercy, not in terms of justice, and strangeness. Just as membership and belonging to a moral community is markedly different from membership in a community based on abstract rights and legal entitlements guaranteed by law. Yet, once we accept the communal aspect of our lives, we are immediately faced with the inherently exclusionary character of such communities and the ensuing challenges posed by that exclusion. How do we ultimately live with difference and share civic space with individuals and groups that embrace a radically different view of the good life, different notions of divine commandments, and different social definitions of communal membership? How can we even begin to explore an alternative to abstract rights, legal formulations and definitions of human beings as essentially individual agents devoid of collective or communal obligations, commitments, and understandings of self? How can we develop an alternative set of practices and a pedagogy, we'll discuss that too in the morning, a pedagogy that would be a significant contribution to how we address social crises that are now understood solely in terms of a rights deficiency? Drawing on our earlier classification of the need to return to particularities and to positional and context-dependent knowledge may, I think, provide some direction. Thus, for example, it may be wise to review our often less than critical acceptance of the ideology of human rights in any and all circumstances without attending to the differences of each and every particular case. For in truth, there are no best practices that are applicable globally. There are only the solutions that emerge from within local environments and constraints. Trying child soldiers from northern Uganda at the International Criminal Court may not, at the end of the day, be the most effective way to reestablish social life in the war-torn, ravaged region of northern Uganda. Imposing European notions of personhood and gender on the refugee populations of Africa may similarly be less than respectful of people's agency and real needs for self-determination. We must learn to see and respect difference, not just as variants of who we are, but as constitutive of real lived differences between individuals and societies. Differences that must be factored into our political solutions to social crises. Bringing these understandings into the institutional arena of law, not only of human rights law, is of great importance to generalizing such practices. We do well to recall that the principle of difference is inherent to the very workings of our legal system. After all, the notion of differentially situated individuals who must be treated differently in order to be treated equally is the very heart of equality jurisprudence. If the law cares about equality, what does it mean, we must ask, to treat differently situated people equally? This problem is of major importance in all religious freedom jurisprudence and appears continually in cases involving sexual orientation, child welfare, and indeed in all areas where the indeterminacy of difference makes itself felt. While the problem goes back to Aristotle and his ruminations on equity in the Nicomachean Ethics, it is of great and continuing contemporary relevance in all issues dealing with legal pluralism, most especially in the different examples of multicultural jurisprudence and what has often been called the cultural defense. Clearly, though, such practices must be not only deepened within the legal realm, but extended to such areas as refugee resettlement, education, and so on. This can only be achieved slowly, carefully, from the ground up, and always, I want to stress, with attention to the particular case in hand. Rather than deny collective boundaries, we must learn to negotiate them, and to do so through attending to the particular, even as its difference is constitutive of our own. Thank you very much for your patience.